I think the BBC video does a better job than I could have talking about the Rwandan genocide briefly and succinctly. I think there's a couple of things because, of course, it is one video that they didn't have time to cover everything in detail. I think me, someone who studied this case for the better part of 2 decades, what the video didn't include were a couple of important factors, I think, for understanding why the genocide occurred. The first was the fact that the UN had pulled out from Somalia within in October of 1993, so less than a year after the conflict ended, and there was a lot of burnt fingers in the U.S. and other national capitals in trying to help end the violence in Mogadishu and Somalia, and therefore a lot of resistance to getting involved in another conflict in sub-Saharan Africa, including a country that is landlocked and not on the coast, which would make it more logistically difficult to intervene. Also, the Cold War had barely ended. The U.S. was just at its early stages at even realizing they could intervene to be able to prevent a lot of these challenges in countries very far from the U.S. The UN, which had been pretty much deadlocked between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, now had the ability to act multilaterally, and that early effort in Somalia was not seen as a success. And I think that lack of ability to enforce the multilateral will within a conflict country, as well as the casualties that the actors had within the conflict, was not a lesson that was just for those intervening states, but also in others that might want interveners to leave. And there's been a lot of books written on the Rwandan genocide, but I think one thing that is incontrovertibly true was that in the hours after President Habyarimana's plane went down, there were 10 Belgian peacekeepers who were killed, and all evidence suggests that they were targeted in order to try to increase pressure on Belgium to pull out of the country. And there have been reports that the Belgians reached out to President Clinton and the U.S. government to ask them to not support a UN intervention because of the risk of casualties to the intervening states. And then in the aftermath, towards the end, when Operation Turquoise, in which France intervened to try to stop the violence, actually paradoxically allowed some of the people who had perpetrated some of the worst violence to swim in that sea of refugees flowing over the border into Zaire, and what was then Zaire and was now Democratic Republic of Congo. And those people reorganized and helped played a role in destabilizing Zaire and leading to that civil war that started within the last couple of years. And so I think interventions have come a long way since 1994, but in these early years, I think it was important to understand how new the institutions for intervention were, how uncertain a lot of the governments farther away about the costs and benefits of intervening, as well as lack of information about the extent to which that violence was happening and facilitated by other powers. And this is just a brief background graphic for interventions over the last couple of years. I know a couple of students have talked to me about interventions in civil conflict, both in Africa as well as in Europe. And what you see is the countries that provide a lot of the aid for the UN peacekeeping forces are not the ones that actually go in. So you have developed states like the US, Japan, and France as the largest donors, but then the countries that provide the largest amount of personnel are those in developing countries like Bangladesh that I mentioned earlier. And now Rwanda is playing a large role in interventions as well. problematic issues, of course, when you have soldiers from neighboring states that might have their governments might have their own interests for trying to get involved, or those that come from farther afield with a lack of accountability or training. There have been a lot of press reports about forced labor and other unpleasantness in areas controlled by peacekeeping forces. And so, yeah, this is a whole separate interesting area and connects to how populations are provided for in conflict. In connecting to the genocide, the reading for this week by Percival and Homer-Dixon think that environmental factors don't provide an adequate explanation for the genocide in Rwanda. They say that there was scarcity both from the demand and supply side, but it wasn't structural, as the incomes across Hutus and Tutsis were relatively evenly distributed. Though urban areas had few opportunities for employment, the migration was restricted after the onset of the Civil War, including the one that they were trying to negotiate the end of before 94. And so migrants had little choice to move to these kind of hillside areas. Of course, in the interviews that I've read and the other books that provide a micro level rationale for the violence and the Kinshasa courts, the justice efforts undertaken at the village level to try to understand what happened, there's a lot of evidence that the violence was perpetrated by neighbor upon neighbor to try to use the broader national instability to try to seek personal advantage over their neighbors who might be from a different group. And this connects to Stathis Kalavas's arguments about the neighborly connection to the intensity of violence in Greece as well as here in Rwanda. In the Percival and Homer-Dixon paper, they have a number of hypotheses. One, higher levels of grievance drove the violence, the transition from authoritarian rule, the end of the Cold War, and this happened in a bunch of different areas. The manipulation of ethnic identity, also something that we'll see in other contexts as well, and elite insecurity in the context of the Arusha Accords, that the presidents of Burundi and Rwanda were coming back from negotiating with the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And so you see similar themes in the explanation for the Rwandan violence to those in other conflicts that we'll see over the course of the term. Also, yet another path diagram from this article connecting this, showing the reciprocal nature of this, in which you see civil war as a driver of decreased legitimacy and elite insecurity, as well as driving for a new conflict. And so it's difficult to try to see where one political process ends and another begins, which I think is important for you to think about theoretically when you're trying to explain your own cases that you're looking at. So how can population pressures lead to resource scarcity? Specifically, the Homer-Dixon and Percival slide that I showed before said there's both demand and supply-induced scarcity. So demand scarcity is when there's more people, population grows, they all want to have the same resource. Supply-induced scarcity, the degradation of resources through deforestation or through pollution can make certain resources more scarce, and structural scarcity because of unequal distribution, in which you have certain groups that might be privileged because of their connections to the political elites that might have that pie distributed in unequal fashion. There's been a lot of other research on this genocide, as well as the connections to domestic and international factors. This article from Anderson that came out a couple of years later talks about international factors, including the structural adjustment programs from multilateral institutions like the IMF as a way to encourage better governance and decrease corruption that often has a negative effect on people's lives. I mentioned Greece earlier. The loan conditionality from the European Union as well as multilateral institutions were quite harsh on the kind of the youth that we're going to talk about in the next video. Multi-party democratization, another international norm that flew around the world in the early 1990s after the end of the Cold War, and then those peace negotiations and implementation, that in the end of one conflict, you can have those institutions renegotiated, kind of like with a new constitution, connecting to the week 3 of this class with democratic institutional change is an area of time in which there's high stakes and which are more likely to have violence, that it's these transitions in which there is opportunity. And so with the Rwandan case, there's been a lot of stability since 1994. The president that took over with the victorious Rwandan Patriotic Front is still in office, though the question is, when there is transition, would there be an opportunity for people who've been dissatisfied with Rwandan governance for the last 25 years to do something? And so with that, I'll end this section on the environmental factors and their connections with the Rwandan genocide, and start talking about another characteristic of population within states, and that is youth bulges. They could be a driver of those kind of scarcities, which we've just talked about, but then they also have their unique characteristics and risk tolerance as well. So let's turn to that.